Welcome to Workplace Psychology with Dr. Martha Grajdek. I'm Dr. Martha Grajdek. This podcast examines a wide variety of work-related issues through the lens of industrial and organizational psychology. And while many of the topics discussed here may be seen as intended for white-collar employees and their employers, in reality, the ideas presented here are applicable across organizations and industries. Additionally, many of the topics discussed here may be applicable outside of the workplace. I encourage you to examine what's presented here, apply what makes sense to you, and simply discard the rest. Working environments come in different sizes, different configurations, and different feels to them. You may find yourself working in an office where you have your own space, maybe even your own office. Some other companies have cubicles, so you might be an employee where you have a cubicle. And yet, other organizations prefer a wide open space where there may be workstations or large tables where people sit and do their work. Whatever the environment in which you work, you most likely have an opinion on it. You may enjoy that specific design and layout, or you may find it uncomfortable or even stressful. This is an important consideration because we spend so much time at our jobs, and if you work at the office, if you work on site, you as an employee are subject to the workplace and workspace design or layout that the employer chooses. In today's episode, I'd like to address the idea of shared spaces and opened spaces specifically because this is a potential problem for many people who may find that kind of environment to be too overwhelming in terms of senses and sensory exposure. And while this may be of interest to individual employees, this episode is equally as important for employers to hear and consider what is being conveyed. When it comes to open spaces or shared spaces in a work environment, there are many people who struggle in this kind of setting. One of the biggest culprits for this is sensory overload. And while for most people, their threshold for sensory stimulation may vary, maybe from day to day or from day of the week to other days of the week, or maybe even depending on how well they slept the night before. Generally speaking, some people are less comfortable with shared spaces and open spaces than others may be. I mentioned the phrase sensory overload. Let's define that before I move on. A very basic definition of sensory overload is simply too much information or too much sensory input for the brain to process, whether that means for the brain to process comfortably or for the brain to process, period. When a person finds that there are too many stimulants in their environment, that can turn into that sensory overload. It can be very disruptive to the workplace experience. What kinds of things may contribute to sensory overload in our working environment? Things such as lights, maybe lights that are too bright or too dim or too inconsistent. Things such as noise, overcrowding, air quality or poor air quality, and strong scents. Maybe too much traffic or too much movement or too much commotion in one's immediate working environment. That can be a trigger for sensory overload as well for many people. It's important to point out that While most people will at some point reach that threshold for sensory overload, we have to be especially aware that for certain people, sensory overload may be reached quicker and be more detrimental to the experience. Consider someone who may have high stress or high anxiety, maybe someone who is experiencing physical pain, a person with autism, or someone diagnosed with ADHD. Any one of those conditions may have an input on how much an individual can process in terms of sensory input and how long before such input becomes sensory overload. So, whether we're looking at individuals who may identify with one of those conditions or something along those lines or not, everybody has some kind of threshold for sensory input. This is why it's so important for both employers and employees not only to be aware of the environment and what kind of sensory input it produces for every individual employee, but also to work together on strategies for creating the kind of environment that will allow everyone to do their work comfortably. When it comes to sensory input or sensory overload that we may find in one's working environment, the symptoms of how a person is affected may not be obvious, or they may not be readily noticed or recognized by others. That in itself can be a problem. This is where misunderstandings can happen. Things such as morale and productivity can suffer. When sensory overload is part of an individual's daily life at work, they may experience certain symptoms as a result. For example, they may feel more stressed. They may develop feelings of anxiety. They may not be able to focus or concentrate or perform their tasks in a way that they would otherwise perform. They may become irritable or even physically uncomfortable if the environment is such that it is seen as an assault on one's senses, where sensory overload is part of the experience. A person may find themselves trying to escape that environment. They may become withdrawn. They may, as I already mentioned, become irritable, unable to concentrate, and unable to do their work. They may be taking frequent breaks only to escape the environment. But if nobody realizes what's going on, the problem cannot be corrected and misunderstandings can come into play. While individuals can certainly explore coping strategies, employers have an opportunity and a responsibility to their employees in creating that kind of workspace that will work for everyone. An easy solution may be to simply create a quiet area, a quiet space where individuals could take their breaks without being assaulted by any and everything that could be associated with a sensory overload. A quiet place with no TVs, no distractions, no noise, no overcrowding, not a lot of traffic. Most companies can carve out a space for just that purpose. Another option may be things such as noise-canceling headphones. Even something as simple as fidget tools may be helpful when dealing with one's working environment. Practicing mindfulness can be a big help when it comes to dealing with one's environment. Things such as breathing exercises or short meditation breaks can be tremendously helpful. While practicing mindfulness may seem like something that will be done solely as an individual on an individual level, it's important to point out that this is a tremendous opportunity for employee and employer to collaborate. Employers have an opportunity and a responsibility to support their employees and provide resources whenever possible. Awareness and education are key here. Recognizing that the environment may indeed be too busy in one way or another for some of your employees is critical, and then doing something about it is an absolute must. It's important for employers to become educated on sensory overload, but it's also important that employers educate their employees, not only so that they can recognize sensory overload within themselves if that is something they may be experiencing, but also to be aware and sensitive for their colleagues and their experiences as far as sensory input. Awareness and education can foster empathy and support, all of which come together to create a better environment within an organization. Encouraging open and honest communications is also key. Just as the employer should be proactive in seeking feedback from employees about the environment, so too should employees feel free to convey any concerns about their working environment and conditions. The bottom line is that workspaces should be designed for many reasons, and that includes neurodiversity and comfort. And while many organizations have considered things such as ergonomics, sensory input often takes a back seat to design and planning of a shared or open workspace. The bottom line is that there are many layers to creating an environment where everyone can thrive, and both employer and employee must come together to create the best environment possible. As this episode comes to an end, let's review what was discussed. While working environments come in many designs, open and shared workspaces are especially vulnerable for sensory overload potential. Things such as noise, crowding, poor air quality, and strong smells can be triggers for too much sensory input. And while everyone has their individual threshold for sensory overload, certain individuals may be more sensitive and have a lower threshold for too much input. Employers will do well to understand what the working environment is like for their workforce and what things may potentially need to be corrected in order to eliminate or avoid sensory overload. Sensory overload can manifest itself in a variety of symptoms, from high stress to anxiety to irritability to reduced productivity and even absence. A collaboration between employee and employer can result in a better working environment. Quiet spaces and things such as noise-canceling headphones can be a good start to dealing with sensory overload. While tools have their place, coping strategies are also important. While tools have their place, coping strategies are also an important part of the solution. Awareness, education, and open communication are key. And remember, as an employer, designing the kind of working environment that allows everyone to thrive should be part of the organization's goal. As this week unfolds, I encourage you to consider what kind of sensory input you may be experiencing at work. Do you occasionally feel like you're experiencing sensory overload, or is this something that may be happening more frequently? What can you do in terms of personal coping skills to alleviate some of that? And what can you do in collaboration with your employer to do the same? As an organization, as an employer, you have a tremendous responsibility and opportunity to review the environment in which your workforce is asked to perform their tasks. How can you improve the sensory input experience for your employees? For those of you who experience this podcast in an audio-only version, I encourage you to check out my YouTube channel, Stress Free with Dr. G, where you can find the video version of the podcast. Once there, check out some of the other videos. They focus on stress management. Stress Free with Dr. G is found on YouTube, and the link for that is in the description below. Thank you for joining me today. Please subscribe to this podcast. I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Until then, I wish you joy and well-being.